You remember the great furor about anthrax after 9/11. Well, anthrax was the greatest danger in the world. Everybody was talking anthrax, and a senator said he got a letter with some anthrax in it and so forth. And we were supposed to be terrified of anthrax. So I wrote an article for Rick Martin, which I titled, "Anthrax is as American as Apple Pie." Which it was. Anthrax as a weapon was contrived in the United States because Winston Churchill had decided that they had to have 2 wars against the German people, and they couldn't go on like this because Britain did not have the wherewithal to continue fighting wars against Germany, and they couldn't compete with them. So Winston Churchill, being a practical person, decided to exterminate the entire Russian people, the entire German people. And so he came to the leading chemist in the United States, James Conant, president of Harvard University, and he said to Conant, "I need something to wipe out the German people." Now, the Germans are supposed to be the great exterminationists. They're supposed to be the people who want to exterminate other people. But in fact, the only candidates for extermination in the 20th century have been the German people. Because Churchill said to Conant, "Get me something that'll kill every human being in Germany." And Conant said, "Well, fine. You know, after all, he was president of Harvard University, and he wouldn't be shocked by a request like that." So he finally told Churchill, he said, "I think anthrax would be the thing to do it." And so Churchill says, "Go ahead and develop it." And he developed anthrax cakes, which would be dropped in Germany, and it would be fodder for animals, which was impregnated with anthrax. And the cattle would eat this, and then the people would eat the cattle, which the Germans would eat the cattle, which were now heavily impregnated with anthrax, and they would die slow, agonizing deaths. Well, this seemed to be just the right thing. So they made 5 million of these anthrax cases, and they were going to drop them in Germany. But then the war ended. The Germans quit on us, and so they never had a chance to exterminate them. So these 5 million anthrax cakes were stored in England for many years, and finally, in the 1970s, they realized they had to get rid of them, so they burned them. So here you had clouds of burning anthrax going over England. I don't know how many people that killed, because nothing was ever said about it. And so then we heard nothing more about anthrax, and just suddenly they said, Saddam Hussein of Iraq has anthrax. Well, if he had anthrax, it came from the United States because we were the only people that produced anthrax. But no, nothing was said about that. So all of a sudden, we had this terrible weapon which we had to be fearful of anthrax. And the papers were full of it, the news programs every night, anthrax, anthrax, anthrax. And this went on for months. And then when my article came out about anthrax as American as apple pie, anthrax disappeared from the news. How long has it been since you heard of anthrax? They'll mention it once in a while in a passing. But the great campaign of anthrax was abandoned because I had exposed the fact that James Conant had worked on it right here during the war at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Same place they developed AIDS, by the way. They're very active at Fort Detrick. They come up with a lot of stuff. And so they just had to give up on the anthrax because they were using the anthrax scare to also have a new smallpox scare. They were saying that the bioterrorists not only are going to give us anthrax, but they're going to spread smallpox. So they had 17 million decaying doses of smallpox vaccine, which they wanted to get rid of. So the government was going to inject these with 17 million Americans with these doses, which were probably, they admitted a lot of them would be fatal because they were no longer usable. And they finally had to abandon that. But the pharmaceutical companies were dead set on going ahead with the great smallpox vaccination, which never happened because the risks were too great. They would have killed thousands of people. So they had to abandon that. And of course, I say they abandoned the great anthrax campaign. But these things disappear very quickly from the news. You never hear it again. None of your commentators will say, whatever happened to the great anthrax scare, whatever happened to the great smallpox scare. They simply go on to other things because they have new programs coming up all the time. And it's a corporation mentality because we have a corporate state, and corporations develop programs to promote this and to promote that, and every employee has got to get behind this 100%. And if you have any laggards who say, well, I'm a little dubious about this, they're out the door before they know what happened to them. And that once you get out on those terms, you don't get employment anywhere else. Because when you leave one corporation, if you don't have a recommendation from them, you can't go to another corporation and get a job. That's how they operate. Because of this kind of information, we do not know what's going on. We have to make decisions about our country when we don't have the facts. We have no information. That's why you're here today, to get your information, because you don't get it from the press. You don't get it from Dan Rather. All he's doing is carrying out the government propaganda. And we don't need any more propagandists. We want the truth. And that's why we come here. And this is a growing sentiment throughout the United States. Now there is more and more information going because of the internet and because people have email and voicemail, and the government doesn't know what to do because the people are getting information. They're not depending on the CIA. They're not depending on the FBI. And this puts them up the creek because they have to now reorganize their programs because you people are finding out what's going on. You're finding out the motivations behind all of these mysterious foreign policy adventures, NATO, going into Somalia, going into Haiti, bombing Yugoslavia. You know, the old Nazis must have felt real good about bombing Yugoslavia because Hitler had this ambitious plan for bombing Yugoslavia into rubble during World War II. And those plans were interrupted by his war against Russia. So it never happened. So along comes NATO many years later and absolutely carries out the Hitler plan of bombing Yugoslavia into rubble, which Hitler had come up with in 1942. It took them a few years, but they got it done. And that's the whole story of the bombing of Yugoslavia. It was the Nazi program. And in fact, NATO is the Nazis of today. And I was told this in Japan, of all things. The granddaughter of the last emperor, Meiji Emperor, told me this. And she had gone to Yugoslavia to talk to Milicevic and to tell him this. And he knew it. That's why he's on trial today. He's on trial because he opposed the Nazi bombing of Yugoslavia by NATO. And so he's on trial for his life as a supposed war criminal. And I don't know what happened in Yugoslavia, and I don't think anyone else will ever know. But you haven't heard much about his trial lately because things disappear from the press. It's very interesting. They have an arch criminal, and they're going to have a trial, and they're going to wreak vengeance on this terrible criminal. Then suddenly it all kind of fades away. Nothing happens. Now, after 9/11, by the way, you might have seen some commentary about the fact that the government, no one in the government wants to touch 9/11. They don't want any investigation. 11 days after Pearl Harbor, they had the first of 8 investigations going in Washington about Pearl Harbor. But now they don't want to touch any investigation, and the reason is they're terrified that you will find out what happened. So no investigation. The Democrats and the Republicans are in accord on this, and President Bush is in accord on this, that there will be no investigation because there are too many unexplained stories. There is the disappearing plane which hit the Pentagon. They can't find any trace of it. And so it must have been a detonation of some kind. And, of course, the World Trade Centers. If you've ever seen demolition buildings on the television, you see how gracefully the thing sinks to the ground. Well, this is exactly what the Twin Trade Towers did in New York. You saw them sinking gracefully down. Now, an entire building does not sink down when a plane hits it. I don't care where the plane hits it, at the bottom or the top, but they were mostly at the top. But there again, General Parton is a good friend of mine, and he was the explosives demolition expert for the United States Air Force. And he tried for months to testify in the Oklahoma City bombing. They wouldn't touch him. They wouldn't let him testify because they didn't want his expert witness testimony. Leading demolition expert could not testify about the Oklahoma City bombing because he had stated, and has stated many times, that the Oklahoma City bombing came from inside out. They parked this truck out front, which supposedly blew up the whole building, but it didn't make any hole where it was parked. Because these were real demolition experts, and they directed the whole explosion into the building, leaving the street absolutely safe where it was. You could have been under the street and you wouldn't have been hurt. So that is how they're constantly defending their lies and their conspiracies, and that's why you're here, because believe me, we have got conspiracies enough for everybody. I've been denounced in the press many times as a conspiratologist. And a conspiratologist is not a person who knows anything about conspiracies. He's a person who invents conspiracies. And I have never had to invent a conspiracy in my life. I can't keep up with all the ones that are already going on. Latest project is to show the Israeli fifth column in the United States. And that, the Assistant Secretary of Defense. You know, a few days ago, we had a big meeting in Washington, D.C., and who was there but the acting Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, leading a rally to help Israel. I mean, he's working for the American government, but you'd never know it from his actions because he and all of his cohorts were there on the Mall in Washington having this great rally to help Israel. Because at least they're honest about what they're doing. They're frank about it. They're not trying to deceive anybody. They're not going to do anything for the American people, but they're going to devote their life to Israel. And I think that's fine. I think they should go there and devote their lives to Israel. But just get out of this country. You know, I said I was a protege of H.L. Hunt, and I wrote some books with him down in Dallas. And H.L. Hunt did not leave a foundation because he knew they were all fake. And he didn't want some communist giving his money away. I knew John MacArthur also, who had the Bankers Life Insurance. He was a billionaire too. And John MacArthur was as good a patriot and American as you would ever want to meet in his life. And when he died, he left his money to a foundation. And that foundation today, almost exclusively, gives $350,000 awards to a lot of people every year. They call genius grants. And these geniuses, when you read what their projects are, I mean, you can't read it without laughing. And they also have a great bias because practically all the recipients of John D. MacArthur grants are lesbians because the lesbians run it, and after all, they are very partial to their own people. So if you're not a lesbian, don't apply to the MacArthur Foundation. You may be a genius, but you're not going to get the grant. And all of these foundations are totally taken over by people who hate the capitalists who accumulated the money to endow the foundations. They're always taken over by people who spend the rest of their lives fighting everything that these people stood for. John MacArthur must be turning over in his grave every day. Henry Ford, the Ford Foundation, became the most communist of all the foundations. And Henry Ford used to give my friend Elizabeth Dilling in Chicago $5,000 a week to fight communism. So after he died, his money has been spent to promote communism. And that's what it's been doing ever since.